That's what I thought.
And we are good. Okay, let's just put that over on the other monitor. And drag that back. Okay, so let's go ahead and get down to work now that the technology seems to all be in place. Good afternoon, everyone. We are continuing our discussion of Genesis and, in fact, bringing it to its conclusion. This is the final book, the final parasha of the book of Vaeychi. And here in Vaeychi, we are going to wrap it up for Jacob and sons. This is the end of the familial line of the book of Vaeychi and the beginning of the national line of the book of Exodus. This is the transition moment, if you will. But there are still some family business things that need to be attended to. We can't leap into the nation just yet. We still have to handle the family business. And so we're going to pick up in chapter 49, and we're going to pick up from verse 28, moving forward from there. Now, the beginning of chapter 49 is Jacob speaking to each of his sons and grandsons as he gives them a blessing, as he gives them a special statement of, well, blessing is perhaps not quite the right word, of prophecy, of insight into them, their character, and hints at the future. But that's not what we're going to focus on. Instead, we're going to focus on the much more practical conversation that he has with his children. As I tell people, when they're willing to sit still long enough and listen, it is imperative that families discuss explicitly with their children their wishes for when they pass away, how they would like things to be handled. Please, please, please do not leave this for your children to figure out while they are going through the grief of the loss. Give them a clear understanding, make sure that everybody is on the same page, preferably leave something in writing as well. It's not a comfortable conversation. It's not a conversation that anyone looks forward to, but it is a conversation that will save your families a great deal of unnecessary stress at what will always be a stressful time. And we get a beautiful example from Yaakov, from Jacob, of doing just that. He's not only speaking in this living will to his children, he is also taking care of practical matters. So let's take a look at that from verse 28. All these were the tribes of Israel, 12 in number, and this is what their father said to them as he bade them farewell, addressing to each a parting word appropriate to him. Then he instructed them, saying to them, I am about to be gathered to my kin. Literally, I'm being gathered to my people, me, my nation. Bury me with my fathers, although, as I've mentioned on numerous occasions, the phrase avotai, being a plural masculine noun, does not necessarily always limit itself to only males being included. The word avot in general could be translated as fathers, and it can also be translated as ancestors, as there is no separate gender-neutral word for ancestors in Hebrew. The word avot is gender-neutral when referring to multiple genders. This particular translator decided to go with the phrase fathers, although, as we'll see, given that he is talking about Machpelah, the cave where he will be buried, we know that it is not only his male ancestors that are buried there. So personally, I think the better translation in this pocket would have been the ancestors. Bury me with my ancestors in the cave, which is in the field of Ephron the Hittite, the cave which is in the field of Machpelah, facing Mamre, in the land of Canaan, the field that Abraham bought from Ephron the Hittite for a burial site. And again, we talked last week about this wonderful word, achuzah, of a holding, a legal right to claim part of the land. And that is really very much an important element here, that this is not just a burial site, but a burial site that has legal standing. There, Abraham and his wife Sarah were buried. Told you there were more than just men there. There, Isaac and his wife Rebekah were buried, and there I buried Leah. The field and the cave in it, bought from the Hittites. So you can see that there is this list of the other people that are buried in the cave of Machpelah, including, of course, his wife Leah. Rachel was buried outside of the cave. She was buried elsewhere during the journey into the land of Israel, and her tomb is a separate location. And unfortunately, Bilhah and Zilpah, the two handmaids, we do not know exactly where they were buried from the Torah itself. So a number of questions before we get on to the response by the children and their action is, why is he going to such detail? Why is he talking, so technically about this cave? Why does he want to be buried in the cave? And why is he listing the other people that are buried in the cave? These are all details that are additional to the core information, right? The core information, if you were leaving a note for somebody, would be, bury me in the cave of Machpelah. Everybody knows it. They certainly lived nearby it. We've got a whole family's worth of people that can take care of this. We don't need to be given its lineage. We don't need to be given its current occupants. And yet it's here, which means we do need that, but we need it for a reason other than just telling them what to do. And hopefully, for those of you that are regular participants in this class, you've all been sensitized to this way of reading, that when we read details in the Torah that are not advancing the surface level of what is needed, then there must be an additional level that has to be plumbed. And that's going to make up the bulk of our discussion for the commentary, just as a fair warning. But let's look at the sons and what they do. When Jacob finished his instructions to his sons, he drew his feet into the bed, and breathing his last, he was gathered to his people, meaning that he was sitting up to give these final instructions. And then he pulled himself back into the bed, he laid down, and whether he died immediately at this point or whether he died without having risen from the bed again is not 100% clear, but this was his last instructions, his last moments with his family. All right. Any questions? All right, let's just take a little bit of a look into chapter 50, as we look at what comes next. Joseph flung himself upon his father's face and wept over him and kissed him. Then Joseph ordered the physicians of his service to embalm his father, and the physicians embalmed Israel, remembering that Israel is the other name for Yaakov. It required 40 days, for such is the full period of embalming. The Egyptians bewailed him 70 days. And when the wailing period was over, Joseph spoke to Pharaoh's court, saying, "Do me this favor and lay this appeal before Pharaoh. My father made me swear, saying, I am about to die. Be sure to bury me in the grave which I made ready for myself in the land of Canaan. Now, therefore, let me go up and bury my father, then I shall return." Some very interesting details here. First of all, just a quick language lesson. The word that's being used for ready for myself is literally that I dug as a grave. It is more stark than it would be in the euphemistic English. So he is telling Pharaoh that he needs to go. And you'll notice that he is telling the Pharaoh through the Pharaoh's court. Most likely this is because, just like we know in the court of Ahasuerus in the story of Purim, people who are dressed as mourners, people who are in sackcloth or in other ways disheveled because of grief, are not allowed into the ancient imperial courts. And so Joseph is speaking through an intermediary here while he is continuing his period of mourning. And he reminds or informs Pharaoh that this is an oath that he swore to his father, and that he needs to take care of it, and that he needs to return. that he needs to return to the land of Egypt, that he is not leaving Pharaoh behind, but instead will return to the country that he is serving. And Pharaoh said, "Go up and bury your father as he made you promise you an oath." So Joseph went up to bury his father, and with him went up all the officials of Pharaoh, the senior members of his court, and all of Egypt's dignitaries, or elders in the literal Hebrew, together with all of Joseph's household, his brothers and his father's household. Only their children, their flocks, and their herds were left in the region of Goshen. Now, that should begin to ring a few bells if you have read through the book of Exodus with a little bit of attention. You'll know that during the discussion with Pharaoh about leaving the land of Egypt and worshiping God in the wilderness, one of the intermediate compromises that is proposed is that the people will leave, but their children, their flocks, and their herds will be left behind. And some commentators point out that Pharaoh in the time of Moses, was merely following the pattern of this Pharaoh at the time of Jacob's burial, saying, well, if you didn't need your children, your flocks, and your herds to go up for the burial, then why do you need them to go off and worship either? Just leave them here and do whatever Hebrew religious things you do, and then get back to work. So there is precedent for the compromise that Pharaoh is proposing during the book of Exodus. Continuing with our story here, though, chariots too and horsemen went up with him. It was a very large troop. We're not going to go into all of the rest of the levaya, the escorting of Yaakov to the cave, but I wanted to get a basic understanding of the political, the familial, and the logistical work that was involved in making sure that Jacob could be buried in Hebron, in the Machpelah. This was not a trivial request, and it was not a request that was fulfilled in a trivial way. And the significance of it and why it was done is, like I said, going to take up the bulk of our conversation today. But if anybody would like to add a comment, advance your own ideas, or, of course, ask questions, then please go ahead and unmute or type it in chat.
I guess maybe I have a question. Is this an instruction or is this a commandment? What level of authority? Because I know the translation here is instruction, but I also see it translated as Yaakov commanded his sons, and whether or not that makes this a mitzvah for us to follow in our own estate planning.
Okay, so there's two different questions. The first is, what word is actually being used for the giving of information to his children? And the word is used is vaitzav, which means to command. It's the same root word from which the word mitzvah comes from. This is a command, an imperative, in the normal grammatical sense of the word. Now, does that mean it becomes a mitzvah as a mitzvah of the Torah for the rest of us? No, because Jacob does not have the authority to institute commands on behalf of God that would become incumbent upon all of us. Only God gets to do that. So there are commands that are given by people and kings at regular points throughout the Torah and the rest of Tanakh, and they're just using the word command. That just is the normal Hebrew word for this type of behavior. However, it is definitely more than instructions in the modern usage of the term instruct, since the modern usage of the word instruct means information on which you should act, but not information that I am obligating you to act upon. But as was mentioned here, and indeed in the earlier chapter where Joseph is meeting with his father, with Ephraim and Manasseh, Jacob literally makes Joseph swear an oath to undertake this. So the idea of this being a very clear command, a directive in a legal sense, certainly would be a better feel for it than mere instructions or request. This is definitely meant to be taken much more seriously than just the preferences of Jacob. So it can't be used as a slam dunk command for us, but it can be seen as being a very strong precedent for us that we should be doing things like this. But yes, it doesn't quite rise to capital Mem mitzvah level. Any other questions or comments? All right. And I apologize to those on YouTube if you do put a question in chat. Sometimes I don't check the screen often enough. I'm still getting used to the whole two monitor situation. So if it takes me a while to get around to your question, I apologize in advance. All right. So let's go ahead and look at what our commentaries do with these few verses and the reality that is the family need at that time. So we'll begin sort of with the simplest explanation and then show how different commentators, while agreeing, are still adding new information. So Ibn Ezra begins for us. Jacob commanded that all should go with Joseph to bury him. So what is Ibn Ezra adding to our understanding of the verse? Well, what he is adding for our verse is that this is the Alehem, that he is speaking to all of them, that they should bear, that they have the responsibility of burying him. Remember, like I mentioned, he had already earlier had Joseph swear to bury him. Now it appears that Jacob is commanding the other brothers to be equally bound by that requirement. And Chizkuni tells us that all should join Joseph in the procession all the way to the cave of Machpelah. So again, what details is Chizkuni adding here? He is adding that not only do they all have a responsibility to bury Jacob, but that they should all attend to that burial, and that attending to that burial means the full escort all the way to the resting place. In Jewish law, we actually do make a distinction when a person needs to be buried away from the main family home, that some of the mourners may travel to accompany the deceased for their burial, and some may stay at home, being unable to join them in that journey. And those that accompany do not begin the formal period of Shiva until actually having completed the burial. Whereas those who return to the home, having escorted them to whatever degree they could, begin their Shiva when they are turning back, when they are now no longer actively engaged in the burial process. So what Chizkuni is trying to tell us here is that Jacob is demanding that all of the sons go all of the way, not merely escort him out of town, not merely help make sure that Joseph takes care of this, but that they should be an active participant all the way to the cave of Machpelah. And then Or HaChaim, building on this, says, seeing that Jacob had earlier called in Joseph to instruct him concerning where and when he was to be buried, he now made sure that the brothers should not think that all this was exclusively Joseph's duty and not theirs. What he is saying here is that it's not only that they are asked to accompany Joseph, they should consider themselves to be equally bound as Joseph. That this is not a command to Joseph which they will then participate in. This is a command to all of them, which happened to be given to Joseph in the first place, but is meant to include all of them. Indeed, as I mentioned at the very beginning, when dealing with the practical matters of our own families, making sure that all members of the family feel that they are obligated and equal participants in the process of helping someone be put to rest is a very important step for family peace, for Shalom Bayit. I have seen many families have deep arguments, first trying to interpret what their parents' wish might be, but even if they know what the wish should be, sometimes one member of the family will take it upon themselves to be the sole arbiter of how to fulfill those commands. Sometimes there will be arguments about how best to fulfill those commands. Sometimes some will shirk their duty and not feel that they have to, or that they are invited to participate in fulfilling those commands. making sure while you are alive that your family knows your wishes and knows that you want all of them to be equally involved is very important. And then Radak, again, is continuing this additional comments that all agree, but what are they adding? It says, after he had completed his blessings, he instructed them to bury him in the family plot, even though he had already commanded Joseph concerning this. He also commanded his other sons. He wanted them all to be prompt in carrying out his wishes. By putting them all together in this process and making sure they all knew it, there would be no delay. There would be no unnecessary pausing to try and unravel or uncover what Jacob's wishes were. Instead, they would all be pulling in the same direction. You will notice that there is a delay, certainly by modern Jewish standards, for the burial, by having the process of mummification, which is different than the modern process of embalming. They prepared him for the journey to go to Machpelah so that the body would not decompose during that trip. And that took a 40-day cycle, apparently, according to the full ritual that was performed in Egypt at that time. And then there seemed to be a period of national mourning on behalf of Joseph, who was so important to the nation. And only after that were they able to leave the country and fulfill Jacob's wishes to the final letter. All right, so a simple sentence, many different aspects and many different commentators, each helping us to highlight and see different elements. It's one of the great reasons why we don't read only one commentary, because each one can help us see it from a different facet, a different face of what we should be learning and understanding from the situation. Any questions or comments on this portion? Okay, then we continue with Ramban, also known as Nachmanides, who says the following. Let me just get our pages lined up. Rabbi Abraham Ibn Ezra, as we talked about, said that the meaning of the expression, bury me with my fathers, from this translation, that was the term that was used, is that the brothers should go with Joseph. Now, Jacob really did not need to do that. However, he now commanded all of them to bury him in the cave, just as he had sworn Joseph, because he feared that Pharaoh might not give Joseph permission to leave the land, lest he remain in his land, meaning giving permission to Joseph means that Joseph might leave Egypt, go to Canaan for the burial, and stay. Do you not see that it was necessary for Joseph to plead with the house of Pharaoh that they should request Pharaoh to let him go? And he answered, go up and bury your father as he made you swear, as he agreed to it only on account of the oath. So Ramban, who had a lot of involvement with politics, is reading the political side of this instruction very carefully. He's saying by obligating the others, it was not just to put them all on the same page and let them all be participants, but it was also a safety net, that he knew that perhaps Pharaoh might not let Joseph go, in which case the other brothers needed to fulfill this command. And we know from the text, by reading it carefully and Pharaoh's response, that Pharaoh almost didn't let Joseph go, that Pharaoh let him go only because of the oath. As he says, go up and bury your father as he made you swear. If Pharaoh had simply said, go up and bury your father, then that would have shown more agreement and more flexibility. But the fact that he lists, as he made you swear, means I'm letting you go because you've made an oath, and we all know oaths are important, and so I guess I'll let you go in order to fulfill the oath. After all, the second in command of Egypt could not really be respected or listened to if people began to think he was someone that might break an oath. And we also see the additional reason why Joseph would have requested the other part of Pharaoh's court to speak on his behalf. It's not only that he was a mourner, but also because he wanted to make sure that he brought as much political pressure as possible on Pharaoh to allow this to happen. Had it been a purely private request, Pharaoh might have felt more emboldened to have denied Joseph the right to go. So reading through the lines, we can see that there was more at play here than just the family issues, that Jacob was thinking about what the politics of Egypt would be and what would be necessary to ensure that he could be buried properly. Questions, comments?
Question.
Yes.
But also, would this not illustrate Joseph's importance to Pharaoh and to Egypt? He's a senior government official. He's next to Pharaoh. His absence from the land is a big deal.
Yes.
Just like senior military leaders or senior politicians don't go on, foreign tourist trips because it's just not done.
That's right. And parallel to that, Joseph's trip is also going to highlight something else that Pharaoh may or may not want highlighted, which is Joseph is a foreigner. Joseph is not Egyptian. Joseph could have stayed and buried his father in Egyptian fashion. I am sure they would have done that just fine, even though the pyramid phase was coming to an end. They could easily have made a nice Egyptian-style tomb for Joseph, for his father, and for the rest of the family there in Egypt. But this is highlighting that for all of Joseph's integration and all of the family living there, they are not Egyptian, and they do not see themselves Egyptian, and they are willing to let the Egyptians be reminded that they are not Egyptian. And that could have also been a source of awkwardness. But Pharaoh does relent, again, as Ramban points out, because of the oath, and does allow it to go forward. Just a reminder that as Jews, we often are in an awkward position whenever we have to remind somebody that, no, really, we do actually have some differences in our culture from yours. It often makes the other cultures in our country, even ones where we are equal citizens, feel a little odd, because it forces them to remember that they either are ignoring our Judaism to let us fit into their mental template, or that they are being reminded of our Judaism, which they have tried to put past them consciously because they don't like thinking about it. But that should not be one of our preconditions for being well treated and respected in a country, or for anyone else for that matter either. So Sforno is again going to build off this, but he wants to focus on the second half of Jacob's instruction, specifically Machpelah, the cave. We've talked so far about Joseph and his family and the need to leave, but we haven't really highlighted why Jacob is so adamant and goes to such lengths to detail the burial be in this particular place. Seeing that they had already spent many years in a foreign land, he felt it necessary to remind them that that burial plot was legally theirs. As we saw, Ahuzat Kever, that this is their legally owned lot, not merely a borrowed place. Seeing that already 2 generations of the patriarch had been buried there, there was no legal way anyone could challenge the ownership of this cave. So Jacob's elaborate description of the cave and who is buried there wasn't just a random bit of detail that the Torah gave us. This was giving a legal pedigree so that when the burial was underway, if any one of the Hittites came up and said, "What are you people doing burying your people in our land?" they would be able to say, "This land has been in our family since Abraham. This land has been paid for. And Abraham was buried here along with his wife. Isaac was buried here along with his wife. Leah is buried here. Of course, we are allowed to bury people here. There is no grounds for you to contest our right to be here." In the modern world, this sort of legal pedigree would be written out, of course, but written pedigrees didn't have quite the same standing in the ancient world and were not nearly as common, but an oral tradition that could give a strong evidence of ownership over successive generations would be persuasive. And so This description to his children is not just giving them information about the cave, but that is, they should remember these facts when they get into any legal discussions about the ownership of that piece of property. And indeed, I believe that in all the way up until the modern world and modern surveying tactics, families would force next generations to learn our farm goes from that tree to that rock to this river, and don't you forget it, because the people on the other side of the river, they say it goes to this tree, and that doesn't work. Those types of discussions and landmarks continued all the way up until modern surveying tactics. And I believe even in terms of modern surveying, that landmarks are still an important element that are supplemented with other GPS type of coordinates. All right. So continuing with our discussion of why are they making such a big deal about this cave, let's begin with Tur Ha'aroch. According to Ramban, in a quote that I didn't bring because I didn't want to double it up, the reason why Yaakov recalled the details of the cave and who was buried inside it was to add honor to that site, to give his sons more incentive to bury him there. So the basic idea to begin with is he listed it all in order to make sure they understood why this was important. Indeed, in the modern world, the equivalent would be if someone were to request to be buried in the land of Israel, simply having a single line in your advanced directives would be helpful, but having a paragraph or even better, a conversation with your family so they know why you really are committed to being buried there would be a very important step in making sure it gets carried out promptly and correctly. He added, which Avraham had acquired as an inalienable ancestral plot, the Ahuzat Kever that we keep talking about, in order to make them aware that they would have a legal basis for disputing anyone among the Hittites who might challenge their right to bury Yaakov there, like we mentioned with Sforno. The reason why the Torah repeats this once more in chapter 50:13 is to indicate that with the burial of Yaakov in the cave, Abraham's intention at the time he purchased that cave had been carried out completely. He had purchased the cave for 3 pairs of human beings to be buried inside it and no more. This is the reason that when the time came, Joseph did not ask the brothers to bury him there also. We know later on that when Joseph dies, he also is preserved in order that he can be carried out of Egypt at the Exodus. He doesn't ask to be buried in the meantime. He asks to be buried when everyone leaves. And of course, we have to ask, well, why didn't he get buried in Machpelah? Indeed, why didn't anyone else get buried in Machpelah? Why weren't any of the people such as Joshua or Caleb that were righteous that we know in the first generations of entering the land? Why were they not buried in the cave of Machpelah? Why didn't they preserve Aaron and Miriam and Moses and allow them to be buried in Machpelah? Well, the idea was that this was set up for these 3 pairs. And the way Yaakov lists it and the way he repeats it is in reminding his children that this is done. Now, spiritually, this is very important because this turns Hebron, turns this place, this burial site into a critical unifying symbol for all of the Jewish people. Because everyone who comes after the time of Yaakov can debate whether or not Joseph was their ancestor, whether or not Reuben was their ancestor. You know, I come from this tribe, you come from that tribe. Why should you get buried there, but me not? Instead, or why should I feel any affinity for that if your person was buried there and mine wasn't? Instead, by making this be the last of the avot, of our ancestors' burials, it becomes this unifying place where we can say, this is the place where all of our families began. There are many branches from here, but this is the trunk. And as a trunk, it is something that belongs to all of us equally. So it was a very astute move for the future of the nation to limit the number of people who would be buried to just those 3 generations. Questions or comments before we continue looking at this request for the cave burial? All right. So Malbim continues, and I apologize for this having to straddle the page break. I shall be gathered, When the souls of the righteous are released from their physical bodies, they enter the company of other righteous souls to be connected with the source of eternal life. You may notice that we have the phrase that he will be gathered to his kin, to Ami, right, to my nation. And that is what Malbim is trying to focus on, that when he dies, he will be gathered, that it's not purely the burial that is the gathering, that it is instead the release of the soul from the body that will create a gathering of the souls that are together in Olam Haba. However, he does say, bring me to my ancestors, as a second phrase. Since his soul was to be united with the righteous, meaning what point do we have to worry about for the body? It was, however, fitting that his body be buried with them as well, in anticipation of the time of the resurrection. So Malbim is trying to answer, why is he both saying, I'll be gathered to my people, which is a metaphysical spiritual state, and also take care of my body, that it also be together with my ancestors? And the answer is that, well, yes, the soul is always connected with all the righteous of the world after it has been released from the physical form. Nevertheless, there is a strong preference to be buried in the company of the righteous, and in particular, in this case, his righteous ancestors, because at some point there will be Mechiyat HaMeitim, there will be the resurrection of the dead. And the idea here would be that when that resurrection happens, he will be in the company of Abraham, Isaac, and the rest of his family. So that he wants to have a good seat, if you will. He wants to be among them when that comes. And certainly I think we can all understand that feeling, not just of being in good company, but in being in the company of our family. And that is something that is of profound, I think, interest to many, many people. It's one of the most common questions I am asked when people are asking me about Olam Haba, about the existence after this life, that will we be in connection, will we be in touch with our family? And we can see that indeed Judaism believes very strongly that both in the spiritual sense and in the sense of the resurrection of us physically at some point in some form, that there will be this opportunity to be together. All right. Let's continue our discussion of what was going on with all of this request. Now we're back with Ramban, by the way, because you can't see his name on the screen, so just a little bit of information. There they buried Isaac and Rebekah. So it's an unusual phrase because it's in what we call the passive voice, which is to say, rather than giving the name of the actor, it only tells who the action was done to. Now, why would it be written this way, says Ramban? The reason for saying this, rather than saying I buried, rather than using the active voice, was that Esau was with him at the burial of their father, and he did not wish to mention him now. Right? If he had said I buried Isaac, then he would have to also say Esau and I buried Isaac, because it was the two of them that did it. Furthermore, he would have been forced to continue saying, there we buried Isaac, and there they buried his wife Rebekah, since Jacob was not present at the burial of his mother, being in the house of Lavan during all of his escapades. So the passive voice, even in biblical Hebrew, occupies the same grammatical niche as it does in modern English, which is sometimes we use it when we don't want to say who did what, because we would like to not focus on that. Jacob doesn't want to say, Esau and I buried our father, and Esau buried my mother, Rebekah. Instead, he just says, my father, my mother, they were buried. And by doing so, it allows the identity of those involved in the burial to be hidden from view, no longer drawing the attention or focus of that verse. So he is doing it to avoid giving credit to Esau and to avoid what might be his regret for not being able to be there for the burial of his mother. Certainly, he was legitimately delayed in the house of Lavan, as well as legitimately still fearful because of his brother's anger and threats of murder. So there was absolutely every reason for him not to be there for the burial of Rebecca, but that doesn't mean that he wants to dwell on it. And so he constructs the sentence in a way that can avoid drawing additional, perhaps personally painful attention to it. Sorry, things like that I always find very interesting to grammar geeks, because there are so many different ways to say different things. And when the Torah chooses one way over another, it is befitting that we take the time to figure out why, and to recognize that this is a human being that is showing his feelings by how he expresses himself in this way. Of course, hopefully that also teaches us to pay attention when other human beings are talking, and when they choose to use passive voice or not, that they may also be showing some of their feelings on different topics. But he then continues, "It is possible that by saying, 'And there I buried Leah,' Jacob hinted to them that he had already taken possession of the cave. By pointing out that he had already exercised his right to bury one of his wives there, he is staking a claim. Because remember, he's got a brother. And he wanted to avoid lest Esau and his children protest his being buried there by claiming that the cave is his as he was the firstborn, and he is deserving of being buried with his ancestors." Right? Esau has a legitimate claim. Sure, we've got the whole idea that Abraham was buried there, Isaac was buried there, and Leah was buried, or before Leah was buried there, that Rebecca was buried there, that should be why the Hittites shouldn't challenge. But Esau can make that same claim. Now, even though Esau had already left for another country, right, moving to the land of Seir, his sons might transport him from there, just as Jacob's sons carried him. Right? You might think, oh, but Esau's already left. What is Esau going to want with being buried in Hebron, in Machpelah? He's in a different country. Yeah, well, Jacob's in a different country when this is happening. And yet his family is going to move him back there. Maybe Esau's family would do the same. Jacob longed to be buried with his sacred ancestors and to be united with them in burial. And if Esau were to be buried there, Jacob could not be buried there, for one burial place does not serve two families by custom and tradition. This is also the reason that it says, "And there went up with him both chariots and horsemen," as Joseph knew the presumptuousness of Esau and his sons, meaning that this was not just an honor escort, this was an armed guard to make sure that they could carry out Jacob's wishes. One of the things that has been so hard and painful for our families over the many thousands of years of our exile has been that we have often had to leave behind the burials of our loved ones. If someone was buried in Spain and then they were forced to flee during the expulsion, they would no longer be able to be buried in the same cemetery as their ancestors. If someone was buried in Poland and then had to leave and come to the West, they can no longer be buried in the same cemetery as their ancestors. This is something that's always been painful and disturbing to our people, but something that we have had to live with and accommodate as the needs of the moment have often forced us to. And we can see, continuing with this idea of the potential threat from Esau and family, this is actually what occurred. We find in the book, The Chronicles of Joseph Ben Gurion, and in other books of ancient history, that Zepho, the son of Eliphaz, the son of Esau, that Zepho, the son of Eliphaz, the son of Esau, came and quarreled with the children of Jacob concerning this burial, with the result that they waged war. All right, before we get to the score of that war, I bet most of you are scratching your head going, Joseph Ben Gurion? Who are we talking? What book of Chronicles is this? All right. This is a book that was written in the Middle Ages, I believe the 11th century, if or thereabouts. That was a historical work drawing together both midrashim as well as the author's perhaps own creativity, as well as a continuation of numerous oral traditions about the history of Jews from Adam on the way through. It is a book that was very important because it was used to try and draw together a historical understanding of our people over a very wide period of time. And there were not a lot of histories of the Jews being written. Really, the last major one at this point in time had been written by Josephus in the Antiquities. So it was critical that this was written, but we should also be a little skeptical of some of its contents. It doesn't always agree with itself, and it doesn't often agree with its own editions. There have been numerous versions that were written over the next few hundred years. So we can't say that we have the absolute correct official first version, nor should we believe everything in it even still. However, it was considered a very important resource during the Middle Ages, and that is why Ramban is referring to it, as it does capture the Midrash and the idea that when this burial was taking place, that the people of Esau's family, the Edomites, came and tried to stop the burial that came from the burial of Jacob. But the power of Joseph prevailed, and they captured him, meaning they captured Zepho, together with his choice army, and they brought them to Egypt. So that's what Egyptians would do. There, Zepho remained in prison all the days of Joseph. But upon his death, meaning upon Joseph's death, he escaped from there and went to the land of Campania, which is in Italy. And there he ruled over the Cathians in Rome, and ultimately was crowned ruler over the land of Italy. It was he who first reigned over Rome, and it was he who built the first and largest palace ever built in Rome. So this is one of the many places where the Edomites were attached to the rise of Rome. Indeed, as we've talked about in previous classes, Edom, the nation that came from Esau, becomes a stand-in word for the Roman Empire in much of rabbinic literature. And this is one of the narrative threads that attaches the Edomites to the land of Rome. So if you're ever wondering and hadn't watched any of the previous discussions about this, this is one of the places that we get the idea that the Romans are descended from Esau, literally, not merely culturally. Questions or comments before we wrap up with Ramban's finale? All right. It is fairly self-explanatory, but let's see what he has to finish off with. Joseph did not command that he be carried and buried now in the land as his father had commanded, meaning Joseph, as we talked about at the end of Vaeychi, doesn't say, take me up now. Instead, we didn't because the house of Pharaoh would not permit it, since he was a source of honor to them. Furthermore, if his brothers and his father's house were to accompany him, the people of the land would rob and steal whatever they had, and it would not be respectful behavior for others to transport him there. So, a number of very important reasons, says Ramban, that Joseph could not be buried the same way Jacob was buried, is that he was too important. The Egyptians were simply not going to allow him to be buried. You could imagine if there was a Jewish president, if he or she passed away, that the American public would probably be a little upset if his family or her family tried to bury him in Israel. Not to mention all of the horrible attacks we would certainly suffer from the anti-Semites. But it would just be uncomfortable for the nation to imagine somebody that occupied such an important and beloved place within the country to be buried outside of it. So the Egyptians were not keen to send Joseph at all. And the brothers themselves, well, now they didn't have their political ally, their Joseph, in the palace of Pharaoh. So why would Pharaoh send an armed guard with them the way he did with Joseph? Instead, they would be on their own. And they were not of significant strength. They didn't have their own army. They didn't have their own chariots to be able to send up Joseph properly without risk of attack. And doing it in some other surreptitious way would simply be disrespectful. So Joseph instead said, you'll go, I'll go when all of you go, rather than making a minor trip. When we all leave, that's when you'll take me. And so that was the right decision. Now, you'll notice, hopefully in terms of practical opinions for the modern world, that it was the right decision for Jacob to be buried as he wished in the cave of Machpelah, and it was the right decision of Joseph not to force his family to bury him in Machpelah for the many different reasons that we have discussed. When it comes time for preparing the honor for our beloved deceased, there isn't a one-size-fits-all rule. This is something we've had to wrestle with during COVID, during these last 18 months, almost 2 years, where we have had to adapt, adjust, and try to make sure that we could bury people with respect and dignity while still managing the different issues that this disease has brought to us. The disease may be new, but the need to adapt and to adjust, the need to carry out wishes in different ways, in different places, in different times, is one that always has to be done with sensitivity and compassion, and one that hopefully people will be attentive to before the need arrives, so that they can best honor those wishes with whatever the current situation allows. So with that, please make sure that you do talk with your family. Let them know your wishes, and let them know that they will have your blessing for them to handle it in whatever is the best way they can when the time comes. Any questions or comments?
No.
All right. Well, thank you all very much for joining me for this study. I will see you again on next Wednesday, or perhaps tonight for Mishnah, or tomorrow night for Pathway to Judaism.